Uh, Louis-Philippe Rochon is a professor at Laurentian University. He is also the director of Monetary Policy Institute and also the editor-in-chief of the Review of Political Economy. Louis-Philippe will give us his presentation today on monetary austerity, inflation, and inequality. Terribly important topic for the Turkish audience and all over the globe. Louis-Philippe, many thanks. The floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind invitation. I want to take a few minutes to say hello to my students who may be watching on YouTube. So thank you very much. It's nice to see old friends on here and new ones as well. So I'm going to give a talk today. It's a slightly different from the original title that had been proposed a while back, mainly because inflation has become such an issue right now, with some disagreements with other post-Keynesians on the topic. Marc Lavoie, who spoke last week, sent me his slides, and you know, we've been having this discussion for the past year, Marc and I, on what to do about inflation. So we have a little bit of disagreements that I'm trying to resolve. But I wanted to address the issue of inflation. This is a talk that I gave last week at the United Nations in New York. I was in New York for the Easterns, and I was kindly invited to the United Nations, and I gave this talk, and I think it was well received. And this is a talk, but it's been updated since then, just because new papers, new comments, new things come up all the time. So there you go. So just before I get into the talk, sort of for the past year and a half, I've been trying to push the boundaries of monetary policy from a heterodox or post-Keynes perspective. And I find that discussions over monetary policy and its potential effects, you know, standard stuff on unemployment and growth, I think it's just not enough, that we need to sort of peel the layers back and look at some extended consequences of monetary policy. And in that sense, I created a book series with Elgar. And so far, I think we've got 7 or 8 books published in the last year. And each book deals with a specific topic. So, for example, monetary policy and income distribution and the environment, social responsibility and democracy, and the future of money, that is, you know, monetary policy and electronic money and the sorts. And we got a number of books coming now in the next year. One on monetary policy and gender, you know, which is the only book of its kind. So I'm very happy with that one. One on financial stability. One on monetary policy implementation. We got one on dollarization. So a number of other books, and the whole purpose and objective is to sort of, like I said, sort of explore and push the limits of monetary policy. And a central question that we need to ask ourselves is whether we are asking central banks to do too much. Is it too much to ask central banks to look at income distribution and the environment and gender and, you know, et cetera? So that's an open-ended question that I'm asked a lot, and I ask in return. And while these books are not necessarily saying central banks must deal with gender or environment or income distribution, they aim to raise the question of the relationship about the impact of changes in interest rates. And so now oh, there you go. And so a lot of the work that's been done have been transformed into a series of blogs And if you want to follow us on Twitter, our handle is @monetaryblog. And we do weekly blogs from a number of people. We had Marc Lavoie, myself, Jamie Galbraith, Malcolm Sawyer and others, Jane Nodell, and just a bunch of other people. And yeah, we just ask questions and push the dialogue and see what comes out. And we have a number of events coming up. We just had a workshop on income distribution. We have another workshop with the Bank of Italy coming up in March. We have a book on income. The book on income distribution is coming out imminently. We have a couple of symposiums in the Review of Political Economy on income distribution, more the functional income distribution. We have a symposium on conflict inflation, and that's going to be interesting because excuse me, the original, sort of the classic article on conflict inflation was from Bob Rowthorne in the Cambridge Journal in 1977. And so I've asked him to sort of update that article some 50 years later. And so he's agreed. And that should be a very good start to that symposium. And we had got Marc Lavoie and myself, we got Malcolm Sawyer, we have, I can't remember everyone who's involved, but I think we have 9 papers in that symposium. And that is certainly tied to Antonella Stirati, Riccardo Suma, and it's tied to the discussion that I'm going to have today, because for me, all inflation is about conflict. And so this topic is going to come down. So let's begin. So in inflation, and I'm just referring to Canada, but I think it's similar numbers in the United States. I think the United States was a little bit over 8.1, but inflation in Canada was about 8.1%. And if you look at, the last 10 years or so, you realize that that's pretty high and all of that. And it's certainly outside of the norm. And if you look at the data for the past, 80 years or so, well, you notice that for the past, 40 years or so, inflation was relatively stable, has been coming down since the early 80s, and then it remains sort of hovering around a 2% target, which is what officially the target is, or a corridor in Canada between 1 and 3. But it has been sort of flaring up in early 2021 and or mid 2021. And so for a lot of people, if you look at the newspapers, and you see a lot of people talking a lot about the anxiety over inflation and how inflation is bad for the economy and et cetera. Now, in a recent Gallup poll, however, inflation doesn't seem to be that much of a preoccupation amongst Americans. About 18% in March 2023, just released. 18% of Americans are listed as the number one issue. For most Americans, the big bad government deficits, debt ceilings, seems to be more of a preoccupation. But nonetheless, I'm sure that it is a preoccupation for a lot of people. 17% rank it as the number one problem, but how many people rank it as number two problem? So it is a preoccupation. And I think that part of it, is, people don't really understand inflation. They know prices are going up. They're certainly seeing it at the gas pump or in the grocery stores. But I think one of the reasons is that the media certainly has hyped up this concept of inflation. Some of them have called it the inflation monster, and some call it the year of extreme inflation. And these are from left of center economists and commentators. You can imagine what the right is saying. And I think that this contributes to what I call the inflation hysteria. I'll talk a little bit about this hysteria. You know, where does it come from? Well, remember that a year ago, central banks were saying that inflation was going to be temporary. Now, by the way, I think they were right. I'll come back to that at the end. It was going to be temporary, and there was no need to raise interest rates. They started raising interest rates only after being accused or having their credibility questioned. There were accusations, especially in the ECB. The ECB was late to raising interest rates relative to Canada and the US, for example. And there was a lot of talk about how, the ECB had lost credibility and all of that. So that's when central banks started to raise rates. I think that they had to be seen to be doing something. And fundamentally, now I don't know if they still think inflation is going to be temporary, but part of me thinks that this is probably what they believe, even though the rhetoric is quite different. And I'll get into the rhetoric in a second. But and with the issue of inflation in an era of monetary policy dominance, the idea here is that central banks or monetary policy is the only game in town, as The Economist put it recently. Governments don't believe they have a role at all to play with inflation fighting. And so they've sort of given up, I think that's a fair expression, given up the policy space to central banks. And so most of my talk will be on central banks. I'll have something to say at the end about the role of fiscal policy, the role of government in fighting inflation. But having left the space to central banks have a communication problem when it comes to fighting inflation. On the one hand, they tell us that they are fighting inflation on our behalf because households, workers find it difficult to make ends meet. And you can literally see those words on various central banks when you look up inflation and how to solve inflation. And they say, inflation is bad for households who have difficulty buying food and etc. So on the one hand, so that they play the good cop and saying, let's fight inflation on your behalf, trust us. But on the other hand, the way that they're fighting inflation is by deliberately creating unemployment. Which hurts workers. And so there's a communication problem there on why they fight inflation and how they do it. And I think that ultimately, the reason central banks fight inflation is not to help us by baguette, but I think that they're doing it because they are pressured by financial interest to fight inflation in order to protect real wealth. This is what I say here, credibility in whose eyes? Jerry Epstein has written quite a few very interesting papers on this, where he talks about, monetary policy done through finance-colored lenses. And there's a lot to say about this. Like I said, when finance said, hey, you got to fight inflation, central banks jumped into action. So I think that it also brings into question the issue of central bank independence. Maybe officially they're independent from government, which is the traditional way of looking at central banks' independence. But on the other, they're certainly not independent of financial interests. So let's keep those in mind as we go through the talk. And for me, there's always winners and losers when it comes to monetary policy. When interest rates were low, there were a number of winners and losers. When interest rates were high, there are winners and losers. And finance is at the forefront of the winning formula, even when interest rates are low, especially with quantitative easing, for example, that led to massive levels of wealth creation. So when interest rates are low, maybe sort of the euthanasia of the rentier kicks in, such that the income streams for rentiers slow down, but that's been replaced with sort of a wealth policy instead. And of course, with quantitative easing and these massive excess reserves in central banks are now making many profits on these reserves as well. So there's another winner there. So, and I think that the losers of high interest rates ultimately, and I think we all agree in this audience, that it will be workers through unemployment. And I'll get to that in a second, right? I mean, the whole concept of immaculate disinflation that's sort of spreading around right now because of Krugman, the idea that central banks are able to bring down inflation without creating any unemployment. Maybe that's true right now, but there's a point where if you raise interest rates too high, it breaks the camel's back. I'll have something to say about that later on. But ultimately, I think monetary policy hurts workers in two ways: unemployment and also debt services or interest payments on services, on debt. So I think that those have ballooned. I have a graph that I forgot to put on here, but on my blog from last week, I have a graph of interest services on the debt as a percentage of disposable income. And you see it going from about 8% to about 11% today in the span of about a year and a half. So that, I think, is a great concern. And I think that when you look at monetary austerity, I think it's what Keynes says about curing the disease by killing the patient. Another way of looking at it is, what do they say? They say the solution is greater than the disease, something like that. But I think that the consequences of fighting inflation are much greater than the consequences of living with inflation of about 8%. Now, we know that for the central bank view, low and stable inflation is best for economic growth. Inflation is destabilizing. And part of that destabilizing process is all about the de-anchoring of inflation expectations. But, there's some good work now coming out on the role of expectations, and the sort of an emerging area seems to indicate that inflation expectations play no role. They play no role, and especially today in an era of low unionization, very weak wage demands, etc. But there was a really interesting paper published in Roche, my former journal, Roche, last year on inflation expectations. And, it's easy to dismiss, a silly post-Keynesian who says things like this, but it's quite different in terms of when it is said by someone like Jeremy Rudd at the Federal Reserve Board. He published a paper in Roche where he says, expectations play no role in inflation. So he says, a review of the relevant theoretical and empirical literature suggests that this belief rests on extremely shaky foundations. So that has to do with the destabilization with respect to inflation expectations. But even, and especially, with regard to the anchoring of expectation, doesn't seem to be saying, like I said, low wage demands. But this is, again, the vice chair of the Federal Reserve who has said that there does not seem to be any wage price spiral in the economy. And I think, Christine Lagarde has said that as well. A number of well-ranked officials have said this. And it's difficult not to realize this when you look at the data on wage growth. And I'm not even sure, yeah, so, wage growth just doesn't seem to be there. So there's no fear of wage and price spiral, although there is fear, in my eyes, about profit price spirals. And I'll get to back to that in a second. But regarding the destabilizing effects of inflation, there's a famous paper, and again, this is not a silly post-Keynesian who says that, but a former World Bank chief economist, Michael Bruno, who wrote a famous paper, well-read paper in 1995, where he says countries can manage to live with moderate, around 15 to 30% inflation for long periods. Now, notice that he says this is moderate inflation, but this Canadian economist called it extreme inflation at 8%. So anyway, so for Bruno and Easterly, inflation is not destabilizing until it hits the 30%. So 8%, in other words, we can live with 8%. We don't have to go all cuckoo over. Can't believe I said the word cuckoo. I must apologize. But I think it's an official word. It should be a scientific word, cuckoo. But, we can live with 8%, 9%, 10% inflation. There are, costs in terms of groceries and gas for the consumer, but it certainly is not destabilizing in the way that central banks seem to make us believe. This statement was repeated by Dornbush and Fisher, again, quite established speakers for the mainstream. 2004 paper, but again restated in 2022. It is a central bank policies to reduce inflation that are destabilizing, and this is precisely what I said, that the consequences of fighting inflation are much greater, I should have said destabilizing, than the actual inflation rate. And this is what we call inflation hysteria. Now, certainly one of the first times that it was used was by James Tobin in 1974 in a paper in the New York Times. He says, hysteria about inflation may lead to policies that keep economic progress well below its potential. He's referring to higher rates having more damage than inflation per se. Stiglitz in Project Syndicate a few weeks ago, again, same conclusion. Further interest rate hikes will have little or no effect on inflation and will cause far-reaching problems of their own. And this is what I called in a recent paper I published in 2022. Was that? Or maybe 23, I can't remember. I called it the weaponization of inflation. And I think that, as I said before, central banks are not independent of financial interests. And it really is the financial interests who want inflation low and stable, so to protect their wealth. So in that sense, inflation has clear distributional effects, and fighting inflation, the use of interest rates, has distributional effects as well. So this is a topic that I'm devoting a lot of my recent research to. I think I've said these things a little bit before. The issue of immaculate disinflation. For now, inflation seems to be coming down. Why is it coming down? Let's get into that in just a second. Alan Blinder, back in '82, when he was commenting on the inflation period of the early '80s, says that inflation didn't come down as a result of interest rates per se, but really because of special factors. And he referred specifically to oil. Just last week, the ECB came out and said, well, in this context of inflation today, more driven by costs or supply issues. 100 basis point rate hike only reduces inflation by about 0.1. And what that means is that most inflation today is not demand driven, right? Monetary policy, the use of monetary policy only works when inflation is demand driven, in my opinion. So if most inflation is cost induced, higher rates won't help, and in fact may even lead to higher inflation. We'll get into that in a sec. So despite all this, rhetoric, and central banks jumped into action, they started raising rates 8 times in Canada, 9 times in Australia, 9 times in the US. I should have checked the United Kingdom, but probably around the same amount of times. And it is, officially the most aggressive response in Federal Reserve history. This is for the Fed. And we notice here that 2022 interest rates were raised from, close to the lower bound to 4.25. This was before the recent rate hike, in just about 9 months, or 10 months. Whereas, it took the 2004 recession about 23 months to get there. And even in 2015, we didn't get near there for 30, after 30. So very aggressive stand, which is something that we really need to address. Why now? Why is this policy response more aggressive than in the past? Okay. So let's get into sort of the discussion over the sources of inflation. 3 possible sources: demand pull, cost push, conflict inflation. The last 2 are often associated together, but I like to discuss them apart because I think that there are some issues that can be better addressed if we see inflation as conflict driven as opposed to simply cost push. Okay, demand pull, that's what we know. Too much money chasing too few goods. Friedman, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. 2 expressions that are well known that summarize well the idea that inflation is driven by demand, that we are buying just too much stuff because incomes are too high. Central bank pumped too much money into the economy, etc. And in today's context, this is related to Biden's fiscal stimulus. The Federal Reserve that had a lower bound policy for a very long time, marking it, Claudio Borio says that the lower bound policy since the financial crisis is the only time when interest rates were so low for so long. So that was another sort of historical moment. And so, but for many, this was the source of the destabilizing effect on economic activity. And another was simply pent-up pandemic saving. So the idea that we had cash stimulus in our pockets, but we couldn't spend them, couldn't go to the restaurants. And so therefore, once the pandemic was over, we rushed out to spend, and that led to demand pull inflation. Now, Lawrence Summers, now, let's remember, this is Lawrence Summers, who a couple of weeks ago gave an interview to Bloomberg on a lounge chair in the Caribbean with the ocean and palm trees in the back of him, calling for more unemployment. Okay, this is that Lawrence Summers. He calls the Biden fiscal stimulus the least responsible fiscal macroeconomic policy we've had for the last 40 years. No, what I call the most irresponsible policies to call for more unemployment while enjoying a cigar and cognac in the Caribbean. For other economists, Service Stone, who's quite well known to the people here, very recently wrote, "It quickly became plain that the conventional wisdom that roots the inflationary upsurge in the Biden stimulus is seriously deficient." So, we sort of have to deal with, and the question is, how much of this inflation? I'm not saying that inflation is never demand pull, but we have to keep in mind that it probably is not a large component of inflation. It's more of a smaller impact. And how much is the demand inflation relative to inflation in total? So I haven't seen credible numbers on that, but it would be important to do. If anyone knows of any studies, please let me know. And so, like I said, at the heart of monetary policy is the idea that we need to create unemployment. This is a Phillips curve. We need to create unemployment in order to bring down inflation. Now, there's been quite a few statements that have said this, that the Phillips curve is at the heart of current thinking. But as we know, the Phillips curve has come into considerable attacks lately. Bob Solow, Claudio Borio, Janet Yellen, and I'm skipping, dozens of other serious scholars who have said that the Phillips curve is very flat. And being very flat, right, if that flat part corresponds to about 8% unemployment, the only way to bring inflation down is to push the economy along that flat curve and create tremendous unemployment in order to finally come to the downward section of that curve. So it brings into question the use of monetary policy in fighting inflation. In another paper I wrote recently, I've called it, titled "The General Ineffectiveness of Monetary Policy." And other people have referred to the impotence of monetary policy. So, we really have to question, and especially if inflation is not mostly demand driven, we really have to sort of, and I gave a whole other talk on specifically that Phillips curve relationship and why it has crumbled and what we need to do about that. But it really questions, if there is no Phillips curve, there is no monetary policy. I think that's what I believe. Now, you can certainly argue that monetary policy does work through the real estate market. And I think that's very correct. We've seen that in Canada, higher interest rates has completely destroyed the real estate market, and home values have decreased by about 25 to 30% in some areas. So I think that it has decimated the real estate, and with real estate, there's a slowdown in new construction and all of that sort of multiplier effect through real estate. So I think it does have an impact there. But the traditional way of looking at Phillips curve, where interest rates affect interest sensitive components of aggregate demand, and et cetera, I think empirical evidence shows that it's quite deficient. Yeah. So it does question, what is monetary policy? What should monetary policy do if that's the case? And we need to, it's in that kind of spirit that I wrote those papers with Mark Setterfield on the interest rate, post-Keynesian interest rate rules. It's a recognition that this sort of traditional Phillips curve relationship has collapsed, We have to rethink what interest rates do. And interest rates, if you follow people like, Pazinetti or Lavoie or Sicareccia, who argue that it's a income distributive variable, and that opens the door to a different interpretation of what monetary policy should be. But the idea that inflation needs to be wrestled down, even though empirically, like I mentioned, there's no evidence that 8% is destabilizing. But there's another sort of blame game going on here, because inflation is often blamed on workers, right? The idea that it is workers that are careless in asking for higher wages that lead to higher prices and inflation. I'll come back to that under cost plus, but cost push. But here's sort of a good summary of what monetary austerity is. Paul Volcker, the standard of living of the average American has to decline. You see that? It's our fault. Higher interest rates will also bring pain to households because it's necessary. We need to tolerate unemployment. The concept that unemployment is or workers is such a disposable commodity that, we should just increase it to 6.5. No big whoop, another scientific expression, no big deal. And we just have to deal with higher unemployment, okay? Let alone, what should those unemployed people do in the meantime? They lose their incomes, possibly their houses, can't, maybe some marital problems as a result. There's a lot of issues here that we need to explore when it comes to unemployment. So, Alfred Eichner, there's a great quote. There's a great quote by Will Milberg, where he says that Eichner used to call, this idea of creating higher unemployment simply inhumane, and he's absolutely right, okay? And all of this, this is just a quote I just love. I put it every time I can. The idea that, we have to bring inflation back to 2%. I know that some people like Blanchard has said that 3 or 4%, 2% doesn't bring you any sort of advantages over, let's say, 3 or 4%. But I think that even that's sort of the wrong way of seeing it. Even the idea of a target, even 3 or 4%, but specifically about 2%, Benjamin Friedman, very well respected economist, he wrote, in retrospect, the paucity of serious empirical research underlying the identification of the 2% norm is a professional embarrassment. It's absolutely right. I spent hours looking over Central Bank of New Zealand documents. They were the first to inflation target, and I couldn't find anything that justified a 2% target. It seems to be something that was perhaps just, it sounds right, let's just do it, okay? So the conclusion so far is that, how much of inflation seems to be demand-driven, because that's the only part of inflation that responds to monetary austerity. But recently, Joe Stiglitz says there's overwhelming evidence that the main source of inflation today was pandemic-related supply shocks. It's not demand-related. And specifically, 3 sources of inflation is identified: oil and gas, a result of the war in Russia and Ukraine, pandemic-related bottlenecks, and profit margins. So I want to have a little say about all of these things in turn. Price of oil, back to where it was in summer of 2021. And that might explain why inflation has been coming down in various countries. The cost push effect of the increase in oil is receding. And we see the inflation coming down. The bottlenecks. on the left, we see bottlenecks being resolved, and also, the cost of transporting goods to markets has also come down as a result of bottlenecks sort of dissipating. So at the height of the crisis, these accounted for 50% of inflation. So these seems to be dissipating, oil seems to be dissipating, bottlenecks and the cost of transportation falling, and that might be why inflation is coming down. So there is no sort of immaculate disinflation as a result of higher interest rates. These are just the sources of inflation resolving themselves. And so in that sense, when the central banks a year ago said inflation may just be temporary, well, they were right. About a year later, or a year and a half later, seems to be temporary enough for these supply issues to resolve themselves. There's now a last issue, and I know that Mark addressed this, and he's a little bit more critical of this source of inflation, but I'm not. Josh Bivens, David McDonald, Jim Stanford, and even Gabriel Zuckerman, they've all said that corporate profits are at record highs, that they are contributing to current levels of inflation through firms with high market power, able to protect or even increase their profit margins. And this inevitably leads to more sustained inflation. And so we need to consider this. And I know from experience, everyone from experience, we have, here in Canada, the supermarkets, the grocery chains have been accused of keeping prices high. I know certain home renovation stores have increased their prices by 40%. And I don't think that there's any justification for that. I think it's sort of an exploitation of the confusion surrounding inflation, people sort of saying, well, of course, prices are going up, there's inflation. And then, firms just raising prices in order to boost inflation, to boost the profits. I'm sort of a believer in this approach, and I'm well aware of Mark's criticism on that. And I think Mark had this also in his presentation last week, funny enough, but that's all because Mark and I were consultants for David McDonald. So not surprisingly, we both have, but this is sort of, there you go. And I think, this is just correlation. I'm well aware of it, but it's one that I think sort of really matches the rhetoric and the empirics nicely. There you go. Now, conclusion one, inflation is coming down, but it's unrelated to central bank policy. Then it raises the question whether this aggressive policy was even necessary to begin with. It's not a case of immaculate disinflation. Now, there is a disagreement between Mark and myself with respect to interest rates. I think Mark is of the opinion, and I am too, that maybe interest rates were too low for too long. And that ended up being maybe a little bit destabilizing in the absence of a regulatory framework. Okay, I think that's important. I don't think low interest rates on themselves are destabilizing, but I think it's the lack of regulations that lead to instability. But, and Mark is in favor of the recent increases in interest rates just because he believes they were too low. But what should be the proper level of interest rates in the current context is an open question. But my objection to monetary austerity, and and even though I agree with Mark about interest rates perhaps having been too low for too long, and maybe they need to find a proper level. My objection is that once central banks begin raising interest rates, they don't stop until they collapse the economy. So I don't believe in immaculate disinflation. I don't believe in soft landings. If you believe that the Phillips curve has sort of fallen flat, then you have to conclude that the only possible outcome is a hard landing. And so that's why I'm against raising rates so aggressively in this context. And we've had 9 increases in the US. And my bet is, we can go up to 12 or even 13 increases to when we finally collapse the economy. And that's because, business investment, consumer spending, they don't really react to incremental changes in interest rates, but they do react eventually to the cumulative impact of higher interest rates. So we seem to think we're seeing right now is interest rates having risen 9 times, very little effect on the economy. And I think it's because the economy could perhaps function quite well with interest rates at about 4%. But much beyond that, as the interest rate increases to 4.55, 5.25, 5.50, that's when you're going to start having sort of a hard landing. But, we'll have to see. We'll have to see. I want to say one thing about Gibson's paradox. There is a tradition in the heterodox community of referring to Gibson's paradox, especially in the Schraffian tradition. But here's Caldor, interest costs are passed on in higher prices in much the same way as wage costs, So monetary austerity can lead to higher inflation. This goes back to Tooke, John Kenneth Galbraith in The Affluent Society, and of course Keynes himself, who wrote that Gibson's paradox is one of the most completely established empirical facts within the whole field of quantitative economics. So I think that what's happening now is that you have bottlenecks and oil sort of resolving themselves, but inflation still sort of remaining a little bit high because of Gibson's paradox and the profit margin story. So I think this is the dynamics with which we are faced. Could be wrong. And we know that Gibson's paradox certainly is correlated, but what causes what, is an empirical. I've seen empirical studies that show both results, and certainly higher inflation will lead to higher interest rates, and this is what we see starting in the 1940s, where we see prices first going up and then central banks reacting. But I think we need to do more empirical work on this component. So while most inflation is cost push, I would always say that I'm somewhat uncomfortable with this approach because it can lead to the conclusion that workers are to blame for inflation. There was a paper published very recently where, of all people, Joan Robinson was advocating this view. And inflation is a result of strong unions and strong workers and wages. So, and even some post-Keynesians have said that. So, I'd rather see it sort of from a different angle, from the conflict angle. And that, for me, inflation is always and everywhere a conflict phenomenon. Now, if you go to my blog, at Monetary Blog, Jamie Galbraith in early January wrote a blog where he says this exactly. And I think that even at the international, we tend to see conflict inflation really at the national level. We tend to see it between workers and firms, and often, as a cause of workers. And interestingly enough, some post-Keynesians have recently said there's no conflict inflation. And they base that on the fact that workers' wage demands is weak. So they argue there is no conflict inflation, so let's stop talking about it. But I think there is conflict inflation. The very mere fact that a firm decides to push prices higher following oil or following bottlenecks is a source of conflict. By raising rates, by raising prices, they deliberately cause the decline in real wages. Isn't that a declaration of conflict? Because the firm could have decided to simply absorb those costs. But no, they don't want to lose their profit margin, so they raise the prices. So it is them who are starting this conflict, and that's going to be my paper. I'm writing it with Ettore Gallo from Italy, and this is the angle that we're taking, that we have to see conflict inflation not simply at the feet of workers, but at the feet of firms themselves. And this is especially true in a financialized capitalism, where the whole focus is on short-term profits, the protection of profits, the higher profits through higher prices. Okay, conflict is a lot more sort of a profit-driven conflict in a financialized world. So, there may not be wage price inflation, but there's still profit price conflict inflation. And in my opinion, workers are never the source of conflict. They are simply catching up. After firms have started the process of conflict by raising prices, workers want to catch up and want to protect their share of the pie. But then when they do, we accuse them. And so in another paper I wrote this year, I talk about the inherent biases in monetary policy, that monetary policy is class biased. Raising interest rates leads to higher revenues for the rentier class. It's gender biased because of the impact it has, the greater impact it has on gender. And I also talk about carbon bias, but that's unrelated to today's talk. But I think that monetary policy is about income distribution. And this is a theme that Marc Lavoie, Marius Echereccia, Chris Niggle, Basil Moore, and others, and the Schraffians, they've all sort of said this very clearly. And if that's the case, there's this quote by Lavoie in a book called Money in Motion from 1996, which for me is my go-to quote. It then becomes clear that monetary policy should not so much be designed to control the level of activity, right? Fine-tuning, let's stop this issue of fine-tuning, but rather to find the level of interest rates that will be proper for the economy from a distribution point of view. The aim of such a policy should be to minimize conflict over the income shares in the hope of simultaneously keeping inflation low and activity high. And this is what the Pasinetti rule, interest rate rule, is about. Okay, and the Smithian rule and the Kansas City rule that I've developed, it's all about income distribution. They have a different, view of what that distribution should be. But Mark is giving, a definition of that Pasinetti rule. And so this is sort of the monetary policy transmission. You have an income channel, which deals with the functional distribution of income, the personal income distribution, And then you have a wealth channel, which is also about personal or income distribution, wealth distribution. Okay. So in conclusion, like I said, this is the class bias, the gender bias, and the climate bias. And I think this is sort of the levels that when I talked at the top of the talk, when I mentioned at the top of the talk about peeling back the layers of monetary policy and society, for the lack of a better word, or monetary policy at the intersection of society, which is sort of popular expressions these days, we have to look at class, gender, climate, etc. And maybe not ask banks to deal with these issues, but at least recognize that monetary policy has these consequences. Now, very few central banks talk about gender. I think income distribution, class bias, they don't use the expression class bias, God forbid, but they use income distribution. I think that's a big topic now among central banks. But here, only since the financial crisis, by the way, and only because of the QE, I think, was more of their focus. But they talk mostly about personal income distribution and not functional distribution. Functional distribution is about classes, and so they don't talk about that. But another thing that they conclude is it's temporary, of course, because monetary policy is neutral in the long run. So any effects on income distribution is short-lived. The same thing with gender. Same thing with the environment. I have a great quote in my chapter in that book where I say that precisely. They see that as being temporary, and therefore, central banks don't have to deal with these issues because they're temporary. And in fact, these are simply side effects. And this is a word that I found in several mainstream papers, side effects of good monetary policy. Good monetary policy being austerity. But, of course, they're going to have side effects, but they're short-lived. If you want to know more about income distribution and monetary policy from the mainstream perspective, Silvio Capes just published a paper in Rope on that issue, in the current issue of Rope. I did add it finally. So, it doesn't mean, so let's even assume that there's immaculate disinflation. Let's even assume that there's a soft landing, okay? Very little effect on unemployment. Let's assume that. Let's give that to the mainstream. It still doesn't mean that workers don't suffer. So the idea that an immaculate disinflation is a reduction in inflation without creating unemployment doesn't mean that it doesn't create consequences for workers. And this is a case in point. We see that household debt service payments as a percent of disposable personal income has increased over the last 2 years. And these are important consequences, I think, worse consequences than the simple impact of inflation. That's it. Thank you very much. I didn't know how long I should speak for, so I aimed for about an hour.
No problem at all. It's yeah, look, I don't know. I enjoyed your talk greatly. I wished you spoke a bit more. Let me put it that way. Unfortunately, Erinch had to leave because her daughter called from the US. So I think I'll continue from now on. I guess we have about another 20 minutes or so for questions and answers. And if there are more questions, then we can continue a bit longer. Any questions, friends? Ilhan has a question.
Of course, Elon has a question.
Go ahead, Ilhan.
Hi, thank you so much. I have a small comment and a question. First, our mainstream colleagues argue that the current inflation was because of the fiscal stimulus and budget deficit. But it is funny that because firms have to wait 2 years after this fiscal stimulus, and this doesn't make sense. The inflation came up after supply chain problems has emerged. Secondly, they argue that budget deficit causes inflation because it augments the money supply. But on the other hand, they say it causes interest rates to rise because it drains the deposits. They have to decide either this budget deficit increases the money supply or decreases the money supply. This is an inconsistent approach. My question is about, could you please elaborate about fine-tuning? Your argument that fine-tuning is a bad idea. What do you mean by fine-tuning and why it's a bad idea?
Well, thank you, Ilan, for the question. For the record, I really want to say that I find Ilan to be one of the best young scholars out there. As an economist, I think his views are just so on. So thank you for that question. So listen, for me, fine-tuning, is the idea that you raise or lower interest rates relative to your target. So interest rates, you basically use interest rates in such a way as to, in a counter or cyclical way, depending on your objective, but you want to, you raise interest rates in order to lower unemployment. And you raise, and for me, fine-tuning doesn't work because I don't think the economy responds all that well to incremental changes in interest rates. So raising them a little bit, lowering them a little bit, I don't think has that much of an impact on economic activity. And so that's what I call the inefficiency of monetary policy. I think the best monetary policy is, the Parkinge view. Those who are familiar with my papers with Setterfield, you just leave interest rates at a given rate, and then you use fiscal policy to regulate that economic activity or to address issues of unemployment or issues of inflation. And I didn't say this in the talk, but, Marc Lavoie has a great quote in his book where he says fiscal policy is just as effective as monetary policy to regulate inflation. And I think Mark is a little bit wrong there in saying just as effective, because I think that monetary policy is not effective at all. But I think that fiscal policy, can be very effective in regulating prices and inflation. Isabella Weber, someone who's probably well known here, is championing this concept of price controls and et cetera. I'm not sure we should be putting caps on gas because we don't want to encourage the consumption of gas, but certainly on other grocery items and food. And I was in a sort of a mainstream panel, and the comment that was made to me is, price controls would be impossible in today relative to 50 years ago. But my argument is no, they would be much easier today because markets are even more concentrated, something that you, Ilan, know quite well about. So with markets being so concentrated and more oligopolistic than before, price controls should be even easier. You're not, you're imposing price controls on a lot less firms in that sense. So yeah, fine-tuning is using interest rates to regulate economic activity. Inefficient. Let's park them. Let's use fiscal policy. Thank you.
By the way, there are only 5 grocery stores, major grocery
Yeah.
stores in Turkey, so it should be quite easy, right, to control them. Any other questions?
There's one here by Ozan.
Ozan,
Is there a danger of recession in 2023? Yeah, I think so. I mean, I don't, and what you're asking is this: is there a chance of a soft landing? I don't think so. I don't think that, if you have a well-behaved Phillips curve, remember that new consensus model. You raise interest rates, and you have a well-behaved sort of elastic IS curve. So those interest-sensitive components of aggregate demand, investment, and consumption, they slide along quite nicely along that elastic IS curve. And what you do is you have a decrease in output. And because of that well-behaved Phillips curve, decrease in output, higher unemployment, lower inflation. That's a soft landing. But we know that empirically, consumption and investment are rather interest insensitive. So the IS curve, in that sense, is rather inelastic. So you don't have those degrees of freedom anymore. And with respect to the Phillips curve, if that curve is flat, I just don't see how theoretically from those two even using this new consensus or new Keynesian model, I don't see how you can have a soft landing. So yeah, I think a recession, because central banks are going to raise interest rates even more. I wouldn't be surprised to see interest rates at 5.5, 5.75. And I think that's going to be sufficient to collapse the economy. And that's when you're going to go into recession. And I think it will begin in 2023. Yeah. Late 2023.
okay. Ozan is fine with the answer, I believe. Any other question?
Just to answer the second part, since there are no hands being raised, yeah, I think it's complete. It's going to be completely monetary policy induced. Completely. And I am a firm believer that this aggressive monetary policy response was not necessary, especially this aggressively. If interest rates are too low, fine, but we don't need to take 10 months to raise them to 5%.
I have a question actually, and with this kind of high interest rate environment, if they continue raising it, the interest rates, actually policy rate, let's put it that way, don't you expect they would pop up the bubbles in the risky assets markets?
Yeah, but maybe, stock markets aren't doing that bad right now. Interest rates are up, inflation is up. Dow Jones is doing not bad, recently. It's gained a lot back in the last year. I think, bubbles are all about speculation, and you can make money betting against or betting for. So I don't think that, and plus, the only bubble that I'm more concerned about is the housing bubble. For most homeowners, for 90% of the homeowners, their house is their only asset. So when central banks are pricking that housing bubble, it's really an attack on the middle class.
Correct.
So
that's what I was,
yeah,
and I said risky assets. I did not mention only the.
But
by the way, go ahead.
Yeah, but if the 1% face a bubble crash, I don't think it's that significant.
Yeah. But on the other hand, you are looking at this from an American point of view, the American continent point of view, that may have an impact on other parts of the world, including my own country and other developing countries, because then most likely there will be, although not from Turkey because we don't have any hot money left in the country, but nevertheless, there are some other developing countries that still have some of it, and if it goes back to the center, then their economies, because of their free capital flows, may suffer from the reversal of the capital.
No, you're right. And in my macro class, I have a lot of students from Africa. A few of them should be on here. They're from Côte d'Ivoire and countries like that. And they're asking me that because we were talking about monetary policy in class today, and they were asking me questions about, but in our country. And I go, absolutely. And so I'm going to be addressing that question for them. Absolutely. I'm talking on behalf of like a North American. You're talking to a guy who did his studies in Canada and the United States, and I don't think once looked at exchange rates. They don't teach exchange rates here. And so, that's a problem. That's a problem. Every time I go to Latin America, I get these questions. Yeah. There's a question from YouTube. Do you believe paying interest on settlement balances contributes to monetary austerity? First of all, Joe, thank you very much for using the word settlement balances. We don't call them reserves anymore. Because that's what they are. They are settlement balances, right? Those bank deposits in central bank are used to, settle interbank, but and that's why they're called settlement balances. I don't know about that. I think that the idea of paying interest on settlement balances, maybe it's part of it, but I don't think in an endogenous money framework, it really does anything. It doesn't, I don't think it prevents banks from lending or anything like that. It just means that higher rates on settlement balances means that banks are making more profits. But I don't think it's a question of, what else could they do? They could be lending them out or something like that. That doesn't apply to an endogenous money. I hope that's how you meant it.
By the way, I also thank Joe Polito for introducing the term settlement balances. I'm going to use that term in Turkish also, mutabakat bakiyesi or something like that, rather than reserves, because they call it required, even I don't know how to translate that, but that's what they actually are. They are settlement balances. Rather than reserves or anything like that.
And as soon as you call them, when you call them reserves, you have echo of that mainstream idea of what, lending reserves. When you call them settlement balances, it says exactly what they're for. I think everyone should be using settlement balances. So thanks, Joe.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I'm going to be calling them Joe's balances from now on.
Let me repeat the Turkish version for here. Mutabakat bakiyesi. Maybe Joe can use that also. Bakiye means balance. Mutabakat settlement, actually. But neither of them are Turkish, actually. Both are Arabic words, if I'm not wrong. But nevertheless, we use both of them. Any other questions, friends?
Well, if I can ask a question.
Yes, please, Mehmet.
Louis-Philippe, thank you very much. It was very clear, very nice, and I really enjoy every time you talk about this. And monetary policy have definitely limits that what we can expect when it comes to the economy. But I want to change the directions about the EU. Here in Europe, actually, the energy shock, the energy supply, there was something, a really big component of this inflation that it really elevated to an historical level. But at the same time, this EU, that they had these climate objectives, even it was very short term, like 2030 and mid-century. While they were doing this, it was also before the war in Ukraine. And they were very optimistic, and they were considering itself as a global leader when it was turning out to the green transformation of the economy. But something that happened with the COVID and the war in Ukraine, it completely changed everything. And then they started to rise the interest rate as if that this rise of interest rate do not touch even to the investments for the green projects. For me, that I really think that the narratives do not match with the practice. When I'm thinking about the climate objectives of this EU, at the same time, their challenge with the monetary policy. And I would like to hear more from you. Do you really think that the EU is going to have these objectives at the same time playing with the monetary policy, raising interest rates, and intensify even the pressure on the investments for the green projects?
Well, with respect to ECB, yeah, Christine Lagarde just yesterday gave an interview. I'm trying to find the quote where she says that we are prepared to raise interest rates as high as possible in order to return inflation back to 2%. So this is Christine Lagarde. So I have no doubt interest rates are going to go up much more in Europe as well. And, I don't think, I haven't completely looked at the case of their ecological sort of commitment, but, I don't think that central bank, I don't think the ECB will be able to meet those commitments. I don't think so. These are issues for fiscal policy. These are issues for government, not for central banks. I don't think central banks are able to deal with environment very well, or I think they have consequences. I think low interest rates has certainly favored these carbon intensive industries. But if you really want to tackle the environment, it's the government you got to, not the central bank. I think, like I said at the top of the talk, we're asking central banks to do too much here. I think it's okay to recognize that there are green consequences or gender or class consequences to monetary policy, and we need to be aware of those. And I think that certainly that sheds light on what interest rates are. But beyond that, we really need to focus on governments to fight the ecological battle in particular. Another
Okay.
question.
Yes, there are two more questions, one from Sinan and the other is from Oktay. Let's go with Sinan first. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for this valuable presentation, Professor. There is an interesting point that caught my attention in the British prices and interest chart regarding the Gibson paradox. If I am not mistaken, according to the Gibson paradox, monetary austerity creates inflation. But if we look at the slide with this graph, there seems a contradiction in this sense, because prices have fallen and remained relatively low for a long time. However, after the Napoleonic Wars, Britain adopted the gold standards and silver coins were withdrawn from circulation. Namely, Britain had implemented a kind of monetary austerity. From this perspective, doesn't this chart contradict the Gibson paradox?
I think, I don't know. I think the Gibson's paradox is an empirical question. And like I said, but I think it's worth doing a lot of some work on that specific relationship. I know some Shrafians who are working on empirical work on the Gibson's paradox. I've seen some early work on the Gibson's paradox in Turkey. For some reason, there was an interest. Turkey seems to say that there's no Gibson's relationship, but it's an empirical question, and I think that that's the only way we're going to settle the question. I'm sorry, that's just a blunt answer, but I really think it is. I like the argument of Gibson's paradox, but I'm okay with the idea that it may not be empirically supported. And if it's not empirically supported, well, then so be it.
Okay, I understand. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think there are two more questions. One in the chat box, and the other is from Oktay. And Oktay raised his hand first, so let Oktay ask his question first, and then maybe you can answer Tyler's question from the chat box.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for this great talk. So I ask a question about the reasons of the recent inflation and about some news from the mainstream economists. You know, some mainstreams talk about the Biden stimulus plan, which is the reasons of the recent inflation, but some began to talk about the highlights the markups. Even the distributional conflict is also talk, right? One of the most famous one, the Olivier Blanchard wrote as some Twitter thoughts about the distributional conflict reasons of.
Who did? Who did?
Olivier Blanchard.
Yeah.
Yeah, I asked, but it was not surprising for me, because in his recent edition of the macroeconomic books, he added the horizontal LM curve. It generates the almost same results like the endogenous money hypothesis, but without any citation for your works. So do you think does this process change something about the something in the economic mainstream economic theory? So you know, they talk about some distributional conflict claims model and markups. So do you think this change something, or they will continue to ignore the post-Keynesians?
Well, yeah, I mean, Elon and I have been having these discussions for many years now, right? And we email each other all the time saying, "Oh, here's another mainstream that steals our ideas." But in Olivier's case, you know, we have to give his due and I don't know. We have to give him credit because he has been talking about this for many years. It was his comments in late December on conflict inflation, and if you followed it, you've seen my interaction with him, that led to me and Marc Lavoie writing a reply, which I'm sure you read on the Monetary blog, and then Jamie Galbraith writing a reply as well, and Olivier was very he did write a blog subsequently who said we've got to give credit to the post-Keynesians. But you're right, he doesn't say that in his book, and this is sort of what the mainstream do. They it's not easy to be mainstream, because honestly, you've got your theories, and you know that your theories are contradicted by the empirics and the data, and you're trying to make sense of that. So being a mainstream person is not an easy job anymore, because it's just full of contradictions. But Olivier was a good sport about it. I did invite him to participate in that symposium. He did say no, but it would have been nice to have his view there. But yeah, there you go. Thank you. Regarding the question in the chat, do you think a CB? Thank you very much for the compliment. I'm glad you liked it. Do you think a CB could have a major role in a socialist economy? I think this goes back to asking central banks to do too much. The central banks essentially set interest rates. That's it. My view is they should set interest rates and leave them there. Well, that's what the parking view is. And then, I'm a big believer not in monetary policy dominance, but in fiscal policy dominance. I'm a Keynesian, I'm a post-Keynesian, I'm a Kelekian. So let's use, whether it's a capitalist, a socialist economy, or a planned economy, this is about fiscal policy. Central banks, they're there to set the interest rates and to manage maybe financial stability and stability. But that's about it. That's about it.
If we go back to Joe, maybe they are there to settle balances.
Yeah, exactly. Elon, you had
Right?
a
I mean,
question?
Yeah, I have a question. Indeed, on behalf of Sabri, there are two arguments that we're discussing on it. And I couldn't persuade him that interest rates are exogenously determined.
oh,
And
that's not an issue of persuasion. Look, a central bank can control any interest rate it likes, but the US central bank, the Fed, doesn't control the long-term interest rates. That's all I am saying. They let it
They do.
to be determined by the market. That happened in 1951. You see, before that, they were, especially during the Second World War, they have been doing that, but nevertheless, there was this Treasury Fed Accord of 1951 when the central bank, the Fed, won and let the long-term interest rates to be determined. Well, of course, they are doing all of these auctions and all, but the short-term interest rates are under their control. Policy rate, they exogenously determine it. Short-term rates, they follow the policy rate. Long-term rates, they don't touch them at all, even through the QEs. When they purchase things, actually, what do you expect? When they purchase long-term treasuries, you expect the rates, long-term rates to go down, right? Just the opposite happens. They go up. Why is that?
Yeah, but
If you look at the QEs.
First, we argue that, especially it's Mark Lavoie's argument that expectations, risk, uncertainties, and so on, or liquidity preference, they only determine the difference between long and short-term rates, not the long-term rates.
There is no difference. Look,
there is, but
I think we are not going to be able to agree on this. But okay. I tell you, long-term interest rates, the Fed doesn't control. I know it. I see it in the data. Yeah, you see, well, like anyway. Let's not get into this. We are not going to agree on this, Ilhan.
Let's invite Elon and you to have a webinar. I would watch that for sure.
Okay, maybe we are going to. We can debate this. Louis-Philippe, I asked Mark how to pronounce your name, and he told me. I hope I am correctly pronouncing. Louis-Philippe.
But you know what? I've been told a lot of things. So
Louis-Philippe is good for me. We disagree with Ilhan. But if you invite us to a webinar, maybe we can discuss this in front of other people. But that's not going to happen now, I guess. Any other questions, my friends? If not, and I don't see any other questions, thank you very much for the time that you spent with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
It's a wonderful presentation you made, and